A racist teen slaps a black waitress in the middle of a quiet diner and thinks he can walk away. But 10 old bikers, sitting just a few tables away, rise from their seats. And everything changes. They don't call the cops. They don't hit back. Instead, they do something no one could have seen coming. They take the boy on the road, across dusty highways and broken-down towns, showing him the kind of pain, faith, and redemption no school ever could. Every mile brings another story of war, loss, and forgiveness, until the boy realizes who that waitress really was, and what she's lost. Now he's not just running from his mistake, he's riding straight into a lesson that could save, or destroy, his soul. Can a week on the road with 10 hardened bikers turn hate into humanity? Or will the boy's anger be the one thing they can't fix? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The summer heat pressed down on the small Tennessee diner like a heavy blanket. Through the smudged windows, sunlight painted golden squares on the checkered floor, where the afternoon crowd of truckers and veterans sat quietly eating their meals. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, barely stirring the humid air. Carson Benson slouched through the door with his 2 friends, Travis and Mike, their sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. At 17, Carson carried himself with the kind of false confidence that masked deeper insecurities. His dark eyes darted around the room, looking for something, or someone, to mock. "Man, check out this dump," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Smells like old coffee and desperation in here." Travis and Mike snickered, following Carson's lead as they always did. They chose a booth near the counter, where they could better harass the other customers. The vinyl seats creaked under their weight. At the counter, a group of elderly veterans sat nursing their coffees, one of them wearing his old service uniform with quiet pride. The brass buttons caught the light, and his medals told silent stories of sacrifice. Alina Jefferson emerged from the kitchen, order pad in hand. Her warm brown eyes took in the 3 teenagers, and despite their obvious attitude, she approached with her usual grace. At 55, she carried herself with dignity earned through years of both joy and heartbreak. "Welcome to Jefferson's," she said. "What can I get for you boys today?" Carson's lip curled. "How about some service that isn't older than dirt?" His friends laughed again, but their laughter held a nervous edge. Alina's expression didn't change. "I'll give you a few minutes with the menu," she said, turning away. That's when Carson's attention fixed on the veteran in uniform. "Hey, Grandpa," he called out. "They let you wear that costume in here? Or is it senior discount day?" The diner grew quiet. Near the window, 10 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club sat watching. Their leather vests creaked as they shifted in their seats. Their leader, Big Joe Reynolds, set down his coffee cup with deliberate slowness. The veteran in uniform kept his eyes forward, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. But Carson wasn't done. "What's the matter, old-timer? Too many flashbacks to hear me? Or did you forget your hearing aid along with your dignity?" Alina moved with purpose now, her shoes clicking against the floor as she approached Carson's table. "That's enough," she said firmly. "We don't disrespect veterans in this establishment. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Carson stood up, towering over Alina, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You can't tell me what to do," he spat. "You're just some waitress in a nowhere diner." "Please leave," Alina repeated, her voice steady. "Now." The next moment happened in slow motion. Carson's hand came up, fast and hard, catching Alina across the face with a crack that echoed through the silent diner. She stumbled back, catching herself against a nearby table. The sound of scraping chairs filled the air as the Hells Angels rose as one. Big Joe moved first, his 68 years doing nothing to diminish his commanding presence. The other bikers spread out behind him like a dark wave, their faces grim. Carson's friends scrambled from the booth, already backing toward the door. "We're out of here, man," Travis called. "You're on your own." The bell above the door jangled as they fled. Big Joe's massive hand settled on Carson's shoulder. "Outside," he said quietly. "Now." In the distance, police sirens began to wail, growing louder. Someone must have called them. But Alina straightened up, touching her reddened cheek, and raised her hand. "No," she said clearly. "No police." She looked at Big Joe and his crew, then at Carson, who had gone pale beneath his bravado. "If you can make him understand what he's done, that'll be justice enough." The bikers led Carson toward the door, his legs shaking beneath him. Through the windows, their motorcycles gleamed in the afternoon sun, chrome and steel promising a reckoning that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with learning. The last thing Carson saw as they guided him outside was Alina's face. Not angry, not vengeful, but filled with a determination that spoke of transformation rather than punishment. The door swung shut behind them, the bell's cheerful jingle a stark contrast to the gravity of the moment. Outside, the Harleys waited in a row, their engines silent for now but promising motion, promising change. The humidity wrapped around them all like a shroud, as Carson found himself surrounded by leather-clad figures who seemed to represent both his fear and, though he didn't know it yet, his salvation. Mike and Travis had vanished completely, leaving their former friend to face the consequences of his actions, alone. The sirens had faded, respecting Alina's wishes, leaving only the sound of cicadas and the distant rumble of highway traffic to accompany what was about to unfold. The bikers formed a loose circle around Carson, their faces neither threatening nor comforting. Big Joe stood directly in front of him, his gray eyes holding decades of hard-earned wisdom. The moment stretched out, heavy with possibility, as Carson stood trembling on the edge of a transformation he couldn't yet imagine. The sun hung low in the Tennessee sky as Carson found himself being guided toward the line of gleaming Harleys. His legs felt weak, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Big Joe's massive frame swung easily onto the lead bike, the suspension creaking slightly under his weight. "Get on," Big Joe commanded, his voice quiet but leaving no room for argument. Carson stared at the motorcycle, his mouth dry. I don't know how to." "Behind me. Hold on to my vest. Don't try anything stupid." Big Joe's gray eyes held Carson's for a moment. "You made your choices back there, son. Now you're gonna live with them." The other bikers mounted their machines, leather creaking and engines rumbling to life one by one. The vibrations traveled through the asphalt and up Carson's legs. With trembling hands, he climbed onto the seat behind Big Joe, trying to maintain some distance between them. The first surge of acceleration caught him off guard. Carson grabbed Big Joe's vest in panic as the wind whipped at his face. The convoy of 10 bikes thundered onto the highway, falling into a practiced formation that reminded Carson of migrating geese. "Take me home," he shouted over the wind. "You can't just kidnap me." No one answered. The roar of engines swallowed his words as they swept around a long curve, the setting sun painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. Mile markers flashed by, and Carson's fear slowly gave way to a numb acceptance. His fingers ached from gripping Big Joe's vest, but he didn't dare loosen them. An hour into the ride, the bikes pulled into a small roadside diner different from Alina's place. The parking lot was mostly empty, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that drew moths in lazy circles. Carson's legs shook as he dismounted, pins and needles shooting through his cramped muscles. "Sit," Big Joe said, pointing to a picnic table set off to the side of the parking lot. The other bikers formed a loose circle around them, some lighting cigarettes, others leaning against their bikes with the easy confidence of men who knew exactly who they were. Big Joe settled his bulk onto the bench across from Carson. "Here's how this goes," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of hard living. "You're gonna ride with us for 7 days." 7 days? Carson's voice cracked. "You can't." "I can, and I will." Big Joe's expression remained neutral. "No whining, no disrespect, no running. You try to bolt, we'll find you. You act up, you'll wish we hadn't." The other bikers nodded silently. Carson looked from face to face, seeing nothing but resolute determination. "And if I don't agree?" Carson challenged, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "You already agreed the moment you decided to hit a woman who was just doing her job." Big Joe's words cut through Carson's bravado like a knife through butter. 7 days. Maybe you learn something, maybe you don't. But at the end, you'll go home a different man either way. As night settled in fully, the bikers made camp in a clearing just off the highway. Someone built a fire, and the flames cast dancing shadows on the weathered faces around it. Carson sat apart from the group, knees pulled to his chest, trying to look uninterested as the men began to talk. "Remember when you found me, Joe?" one of the bikers asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Strung out behind that gas station, nothing left to live for." "Hard to forget," Big Joe replied softly. "You were about as low as a man could get, Tommy." 3 years clean now," Tommy said, touching a medallion that hung around his neck. "My kids actually answer my calls these days. Never thought I'd see that happen." Another biker, his arms covered in faded tattoos, leaned forward. "Brotherhood ain't about being perfect," he said. "It's about picking each other up when we fall. Lord knows I've fallen plenty." Carson tried to maintain his scowl, but found himself listening despite his best efforts. These men, with their scars and tattoos, spoke about things he'd never expected. Forgiveness, faith, second chances. Their voices were gentle when they talked about redemption, about finding light in the darkest places. "Lost my whole family to my anger," one of them shared, his face illuminated by the firelight. "Thought being tough meant never backing down, never admitting when I was wrong. Took losing everything to learn what real strength looks like." The stories continued as the night deepened. Stories of addiction and recovery, of violence and peace, of lost souls finding their way back to grace. Carson pretended to stare at the fire, but his ears strained to catch every word. Eventually, sleeping bags were unrolled under the vast expanse of stars. Carson lay on his back, the ground hard beneath him, his mind churning with everything he'd heard. The men who seemed so threatening just hours ago now felt like something else entirely, something he couldn't quite name. Big Joe sat apart from the others, his pipe glowing softly in the darkness. Another biker, Dave, settled beside him. "The boy's got demons," Big Joe murmured, watching Carson's still form across the dying fire. "We all had ours once." "Think he'll make it?" Dave asked quietly. "That's up to him," Big Joe replied, tapping out his pipe. "But I've seen that look before. The anger hiding the hurt, the pride covering the fear." He paused, considering. Sometimes the ones who fight the hardest are the ones who need it most. The morning sun peeked over the Tennessee hills, casting long shadows through the dew-covered grass. Carson groaned as consciousness returned, every muscle in his body protesting from sleeping on the hard ground. His designer jeans were damp with morning dew, and his neck felt like it had been twisted into a pretzel. Around him, the bikers were already up and moving with practiced efficiency. The smell of coffee drifted through the camp, making his empty stomach growl. "Rise and shine, princess," one of the bikers called out cheerfully. "Breakfast is earned around here." Big Joe stood over Carson, holding out a stack of crusty pots and pans. "Creek's right over there," he said, pointing to a small stream about 50 yards away. "Soap's in the kit. Get scrubbing." Carson stared at the greasy cookware in disbelief. "You're kidding, right? I'm not your dish boy." The bikers around him chuckled, continuing their morning routines without missing a beat. "No scrubbing, no eating," Big Joe said simply. "Your choice." With a dramatic sigh, Carson snatched the pans and stomped toward the creek. The water was ice cold, making his fingers ache as he scrubbed at the stubborn grease. Every few minutes, one of the bikers would walk by, offering helpful advice. "Missed a spot there, college boy. Better get those corners. My grandmother could scrub faster than that." Their good-natured teasing only made Carson scrub harder, his face burning with embarrassment. By the time he finished, his hands were pruned and raw, but the pans gleamed in the morning light. "Not bad," Big Joe admitted, inspecting Carson's work. "Now help pack up camp and then we'll eat." The next hour was a blur of rolling sleeping bags, collapsing tents, and loading saddlebags. Carson's stomach was growling fiercely by the time Big Joe finally handed him a plate of eggs and bacon. As they rode through the morning, the countryside rolled past in an endless tapestry of green hills and weathered barns. They stuck to back roads, avoiding the main highways, and Carson found himself grudgingly appreciating the beauty of the landscape. Their first stop was a small diner in a town barely big enough to have a stoplight. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few pickup trucks and a police cruiser. Carson noticed how the local customers tensed when the bikers walked in, then relaxed as Big Joe greeted the waitress by name. "Morning, Sarah," he said warmly. "How's Tommy doing with his treatments?" The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, brightened. "Better, Joe. Those rides to Nashville are getting expensive, though." Without hesitation, Big Joe pulled out an envelope. "Pass this along. Tell him to keep fighting." Carson watched in confusion as Sarah burst into tears, hugging Big Joe tightly. The other bikers were pulling out their own envelopes, quietly asking about other locals by name. A veteran in the corner received money for new hearing aids. A young mother with 3 kids got help with her electric bill. This scene repeated itself throughout the day. At every stop, these rough-looking men seemed to know exactly who needed help and how to give it. Carson noticed how people who initially drew back in fear ended up embracing the bikers like long-lost family. During lunch at a roadside BBQ joint, Carson found himself sitting across from Doc, a lean, gray-haired biker with kind eyes and steady hands. The man was quiet as he ate, but something in his expression made Carson uncomfortable. "What are you looking at?" Carson finally snapped. Doc set down his fork carefully. "My son," he said quietly. "He would have been about your age now." The words hung in the air between them. Carson shifted in his seat, but didn't respond. "Lost him to heroin 3 years ago," Doc continued, his voice steady but filled with old pain. "I was so angry afterward. Wanted to hurt everyone who'd hurt him. Wanted to burn the world down." Carson stared at his plate, pushing food around with his fork. "What changed?" he asked, despite himself. "Realized that anger was killing me faster than it was hurting anyone else." "You don't fix hate with more hate," Doc said simply. "It just makes the darkness deeper." Carson scoffed, but the words lodged somewhere in his chest, refusing to be dismissed. He stayed quiet for the rest of the afternoon's ride, watching the shadows lengthen across the hills. As evening approached, they set up camp near an old white church, its steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. The sound of the nearby river provided a peaceful backdrop as they prepared dinner. Before they ate, one of the bikers, a massive man covered in tattoos, bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "thank you for this food and this day. Help us remember your grace, even when we least deserve it." Carson rolled his eyes automatically, but something uncomfortable stirred in his chest. The prayer reminded him of his grandmother, of Sunday mornings long ago, before everything fell apart at home. Later, as the fire cast dancing shadows across their faces, Big Joe settled next to Carson. They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames. "You know," Big Joe finally said, "we've all done things we're not proud of. Things we wish we could take back." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. "You can't change what you did yesterday, son, but you can decide who you'll be tomorrow." Carson stared into the flames, trying to maintain his mask of indifference. But Big Joe's words echoed in his mind, mixing with everything he'd seen that day. The kindness, the generosity, the simple prayers. He remembered the look on Alina's face when he'd slapped her, the shock and pain in her eyes. For the first time since it happened, shame crept past his defenses. The fire crackled softly, and overhead stars began to appear one by one in the deepening purple sky. Carson sat still, lost in thought, as the river murmured its endless song nearby. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as the convoy of motorcycles turned onto a tree-lined driveway. A weathered sign read, "Tennessee Valley Veterans Home." Carson, sweating in his borrowed leather jacket, watched as Big Joe navigated the Harley around to the back of the brick building. "All right, boys," Big Joe called out as the engines quieted. "Let's get these supplies unloaded." Carson hung back as the bikers efficiently began pulling boxes from their saddlebags and the small trailer they'd been towing. He crossed his arms, trying to look disinterested. "That includes you, hotshot," one of the bikers said, shoving a box into Carson's chest. "Those arthritic hands need these supplies more than they need your attitude." Grudgingly, Carson joined the line of men carrying boxes inside. The air conditioning hit him like a wall as he entered through the loading dock, and the antiseptic smell reminded him of visiting his grandfather in the hospital. Old men in wheelchairs watched curiously as the procession of bikers moved through the halls. While the others organized supplies in the storage room, Carson found himself wandering down a corridor lined with photographs. Black and white images of young soldiers mixed with color photos from more recent conflicts. He was about to turn away when a familiar face caught his eye. The photo showed a young black man in desert camouflage, his arm around another soldier, both grinning broadly despite the Afghan mountains looming behind them. The soldier's smile was warm and genuine, just like Alina's. Carson's stomach clenched as he read the small plaque beneath. "Sergeant Marcus Jefferson, 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, killed in action 2017. "That's Alina's boy," a voice said behind him. Carson turned to find an elderly man in a polo shirt with "Director" embroidered on the pocket. "She's here every Thursday, rain or shine. Brings home-baked cookies for the vets, sits and listens to their stories." The director shook his head. "Lost Marcus 6 years ago. Sergeant Porter, his commanding officer, still comes by to visit her when she's here." The name hit Carson like a physical blow. Sergeant Porter, the old veteran he'd mocked at the diner. The one wearing the same unit patch as the soldier in the photo. Carson felt the blood drain from his face as the full weight of what he'd done crashed over him. "You okay, son?" the director asked. "You look a little pale." Carson mumbled something unintelligible and hurried away, his chest tight. He found the nearest bathroom and locked himself inside, hands trembling as he gripped the sink. His reflection in the mirror looked strange, young and scared and sick with realization. He'd slapped a grieving mother. He'd mocked her son's commanding officer. The cruelty of it made him want to throw up. They finished unloading the supplies and left the veterans' home by mid-afternoon. Carson was quiet during the ride to the motel, the rumble of the motorcycle unable to drown out his thoughts. When they checked in, he immediately claimed the bathroom, locking the door behind him. Sitting on the edge of the tub, Carson felt himself shaking. All his life, he'd pushed away feelings of shame or guilt, covering them with anger and attitude. But this was different. This guilt had teeth, and it was tearing him apart inside. After what felt like hours, he slipped out of the room. The other bikers were playing cards, but no one tried to stop him as he walked outside. The parking lot was quiet, lit only by the yellow glow of sodium lights. Carson found himself drawn to the line of motorcycles, their chrome surfaces reflecting the night in distorted waves. He stared at his warped reflection in Big Joe's bike, barely recognizing himself. The cocky kid from the diner seemed like a stranger now, or worse, like someone he never wanted to be again. "Chrome's good for thinking," Big Joe's voice came softly from behind him. "Shows you different versions of yourself." Carson didn't turn around, but he heard the big man settle onto the curb nearby. For a long while, they sat in silence, watching moths dance around the parking lot lights. "I was 23 when I went to Vietnam," Big Joe finally said, his voice distant. "Young, scared, trying to act tough. One night we got word that the enemy was hiding in this village. Things went wrong. People panicked. I followed orders and—" He paused, taking a deep breath. "We burned that village. I can still hear the screams sometimes." Carson turned to look at him. Big Joe's face was lined with old pain in the harsh light. "Carried that guilt for 50 years, he continued. "Tried running from it, tried drinking it away, tried covering it with anger. None of it worked." He looked directly at Carson. "You can't outdrive guilt, son. You can only face it." Carson felt tears threatening and blinked hard. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "How do I fix what I broke?" Big Joe's hand came to rest on his shoulder, heavy and warm. "By starting with yourself," he said quietly. "That's always where healing begins." They sat there together in the quiet night, surrounded by chrome and shadows, while Carson let the tears finally come. The Tennessee sunrise painted the motel parking lot in soft orange and pink, catching the chrome of the motorcycles and making them gleam like new pennies. Carson had been up since before dawn, his mind too full for sleep. He sat on the concrete curb, watching the light change and thinking about everything he'd learned the day before. When the other bikers emerged from their rooms, they found him already loading their saddlebags. He worked quietly, methodically, the way they'd shown him. No one mentioned the change. They just worked alongside him, their usual morning banter floating through the cool air. "Gonna grab some breakfast at May's down the road," Big Joe announced, zipping up his leather jacket. "Pack it up, boys." The diner was a small place with peeling paint and window boxes full of bright red geraniums. Yesterday, Carson would have sneered at its shabby appearance. Today, he noticed how the flowers made the place more welcoming, how the worn booths spoke of years of customers and conversations. A tired-looking waitress with graying hair approached their table. Carson recognized her from yesterday. He'd made a sarcastic comment about her slow service that had made her face tighten with hurt. "Coffee all around?" she asked, not quite meeting their eyes. Before anyone could answer, Carson cleared his throat. "Ma'am?" The waitress looked at him warily. "I want to apologize for how I acted yesterday. I was rude, and you didn't deserve that. I'm sorry." The surprise on her face matched the raised eyebrows of the bikers. She blinked rapidly, then gave him a small, genuine smile. "Well, thank you, young man. That's very kind of you to say." The bikers didn't make a big deal of it. No pats on the back or words of praise. But when Doc passed him the syrup for his pancakes without being asked, and Smokey included him in a story about his first motorcycle, Carson felt the shift. He was no longer just the kid they were babysitting. He was becoming part of something. After breakfast, they rode for an hour to a small town where American flags lined the main street. A sign announced, "Veterans Appreciation Picnic, all welcome." The town square was filled with folding tables and chairs, cooking grills, and red, white, and blue bunting. "All right, crew," Big Joe called out as they parked. "Let's get to work." Carson found himself caught up in a whirlwind of activity. He helped unfold tables and arrange chairs, carried coolers of drinks, and hung banners between trees. The work was simple, but satisfying. Every time he finished one task, someone would point him toward another. As people began arriving, veterans in their caps and jackets, families with children, elderly couples carrying covered dishes, Carson found himself assigned to the welcome table. At first, he felt awkward, but then he remembered how Alina always greeted her customers with genuine warmth and eye contact. "Welcome to the picnic," he said to each person, trying to put real meaning behind the words. "Thank you for coming." An elderly man in a Korean War veteran's cap stopped at his table. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot to see young people here." The words hit Carson like a physical touch. Thank you. Such simple words, but he realized he'd rarely heard them, because he'd rarely done anything to deserve them. Throughout the afternoon, he worked alongside the bikers, serving food, refilling drinks, and listening to snippets of stories from veterans of different wars. He watched how Big Joe's crew treated each person with respect, whether they were generals or privates, rich or poor. As evening fell, string lights came on over the square, creating a warm glow. Someone brought out a guitar, and soon music mixed with laughter and conversation. Carson found a quiet corner and pulled out the small, leather-bound notebook Big Joe had given him that morning. "Sometimes," Big Joe had said, "the words we need to say get stuck inside us. Writing them down can help them find their way out." Now, Carson opened to the first blank page. His hand trembled slightly as he began to write. "Dear Mom, I know I've been hard to love lately. I've been angry about Dad leaving, about moving, about everything. But that's no excuse for how I've treated you." The words came slowly at first, then faster. He wrote to his mother about his shame and regret, about wanting to be better. When that letter was done, he started another. "Dear Alina, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to tell you how sorry I am." This letter was harder to write. His eyes burned as he described learning about her son, about understanding the depth of his cruelty that day in the diner. He wrote about wanting to make amends, even if he didn't know how. Finally, he started a third letter. "Dear Carson, this is me writing to you from 5 days ago. You think you're tough. You think nothing can touch you. You're wrong." He wrote to his younger self about the pain he was causing others, about the emptiness of his anger, about the strength it takes to be kind. As he wrote, he could hear the bikers' voices nearby, telling stories, sharing jokes, their deep laughter rolling across the square. Someone said grace over the remaining food. Others joined in with, "Amen." Carson looked up from his notebook, watching these men he'd once thought of as scary and dangerous. Now he saw something different: brotherhood, faith, the kind of strength that comes from helping others instead of hurting them. The string lights swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting moving shadows across his notebook pages. For the first time, in as long as he could remember, the constant knot of anger in his chest had loosened. In its place was something unfamiliar but welcome, a quiet sort of peace, like the moment after a storm passes. He looked down at his notebook, at the words that had poured out of him, and realized that while he couldn't change who he'd been, he could choose who he would become. The thought settled over him like a warm blanket as he sat there, surrounded by the gentle murmur of voices and the soft glow of the lights above. The sun rose and set twice more as the bikers continued their journey. Each mile brought new lessons, wrapped in the rumble of engines and the whisper of wind. Carson found himself settling into the rhythm of life on the road. Early mornings, simple meals cooked over camp stoves, and countless small moments that slowly changed his heart. They stopped at a rundown motel just outside of Memphis. While the others checked in, Red Malone caught Carson staring at his bike, a gleaming Harley with flames painted along its tank. "She's something, ain't she?" Red said, running his hand along the chrome. His voice was gruff but gentle, like sandpaper worn smooth. "Got her after I finally let go of something that was eating me alive." Carson looked up, curious. "What do you mean?" Red settled onto a nearby bench, patting the space beside him. The evening air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of approaching rain. "Pull up a seat, kid. Let me tell you about a man named Thomas Walker." Carson sat, watching as Red's weathered face grew serious. The older man pulled out a pack of gum, offered Carson a piece, then began his story. "Thomas Walker was my neighbor growing up. When I was 15, he accidentally hit my dog with his truck. Didn't stop, didn't apologize. I carried that hate for 30 years. Red shook his head slowly. "Let it poison everything. My marriages, my relationships with my kids, my whole life. Hate's funny that way. It promises justice but delivers chains instead." Thunder rolled in the distance as Red continued. "One day I saw Thomas at a gas station. He was old by then, struggling with his walker. My first thought was satisfaction. Seeing him weak made me feel powerful. But then..." Red's voice caught. "Then I saw how heavy that hate was. 3 decades of carrying it, and for what?" Carson shifted uncomfortably, thinking about his own anger. At his father for leaving, at the world for not being fair, at himself for not being enough. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "I helped him pump his gas, helped him back to his car. And you know what? He remembered that day with my dog, had been carrying his own guilt all those years." Red's eyes grew distant. "We both cried right there at that gas station. 2 grown men, bawling like babies between the pumps." Carson stared at his hands. "Did forgiving him feel real? Or did you just say the words?" Red smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Forgiveness ain't about feelings, son. It's about actions. It gets real when you start treating others better than you think they deserve. That's when the miracle happens. Your heart catches up to your choices." The first drops of rain began to fall as other bikers emerged from their rooms, calling them inside. But Carson stayed put, letting Red's words sink in. Later that night, after a simple dinner of hamburgers and beans, the group made their way to a nearby lake. The rain had passed, leaving behind a clear sky filled with stars. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light across the water. Carson watched the bikers joke and laugh around the campfire. These men who looked so threatening at first now felt like family. He gathered his courage and approached Big Joe, who sat slightly apart, cleaning his glasses with his bandana. "Could you..." Carson cleared his throat. "Could you teach me to ride?" Big Joe looked up, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. "Thought you'd never ask." The other bikers gathered around as Big Joe led Carson to his Harley. For the next hour, under the bright moonlight, Big Joe patiently explained the basics: clutch, throttle, brake. The gravel lot became their classroom. "Easy now," Big Joe said, holding the bike steady as Carson found his balance. "Let the clutch out slow, slower than that." The engine stalled. Carson felt his face flush, but no one laughed. Instead, they called out encouragement. "We all started somewhere, kid. You're doing fine. Try again. And he did. Again and again, until finally the bike moved forward smoothly. Carson circled the lot once, then twice, feeling the machine respond to his touch. The sensation was incredible, like flying just above the ground. When he finally brought the bike to a stop, the men erupted in cheers. Red slapped him on the back. Doc gave him a bear hug. Even the quieter bikers joined in the celebration. Carson felt something bubble up from deep inside. A laugh. Not the mocking kind he'd used so often, but a real laugh, full of joy and freedom. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Maybe when he was very young, before his father left, before the anger took root. Later, as the fire died down and most of the men headed to their tents, Carson remained by the lake. The moon's reflection rippled on the water, broken into 1,000 pieces of light. Without really thinking about it, he found himself whispering into the night. "God?" His voice was barely audible. "I don't know if you're listening. I don't even know if I'm doing this right, but thank you. For these men. For this chance. For—" He paused, searching for words he didn't fully understand. "For whatever's happening to me." The prayer felt awkward, incomplete. But somehow that didn't matter. Like learning to ride the motorcycle, maybe the important thing was just beginning, just taking that first wobbly step toward something new. The moonlight continued to dance on the water, and somewhere in the darkness, a whippoorwill began to sing. The morning sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as Carson helped the crew pack up their campsite. His muscles were sore from yesterday's motorcycle lesson, but it was a good kind of pain, the kind that reminded him he was growing, changing. The rumble of dozens of motorcycles filled the air as they approached the rally grounds. Carson's eyes widened at the sight. Hundreds of bikes lined up in neat rows, American flags snapping in the breeze, and a massive stage set up at the center of it all. A banner stretched across the entrance. 23rd Annual Veterans Rally for Youth. Quite a sight, isn't it? Big Joe's voice carried over the noise. This here's where bikers from all over come together to raise money for kids who need a chance. Kinda like the chance we're giving you. Carson nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The fairgrounds were packed, with leather-clad bikers, their patches telling stories of different clubs and chapters. The smell of barbecue and the sound of country music filled the air. As they walked through the crowd, Carson noticed something surprising. Families were everywhere. Children ran between the bikes, their faces painted with temporary tattoos. Mothers pushed strollers, and teenagers helped set up food stands. Not what you expected from a biker rally, is it? Red chuckled, catching Carson's expression. No, Carson admitted. I thought it would be more dangerous, Doc finished for him. Like those movies where bikers tear up towns and start fights? Carson felt his face flush. Yeah, I guess. Real strength isn't about causing trouble, Big Joe said, clapping Carson on the shoulder. It's about preventing it, building something good instead of tearing things down. They made their way towards the stage, where veterans were taking turns sharing their stories. Each tale was different, but they all spoke of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the power of second chances. Carson listened, mesmerized, as a young veteran described how local bikers had helped him after he lost both legs in Afghanistan. Another spoke about a mentorship program that kept kids off the streets. These weren't just stories. They were testament to the transformative power of compassion. Suddenly, Big Joe's hand was on his back, gently but firmly pushing him toward the stage steps. What are you doing? Carson whispered, panic rising in his chest. Time to share your story, kid, Big Joe said with a smile that brooked no argument. I can't. I don't know what to say. Sure you do. Just speak from your heart. Before Carson could protest further, He found himself climbing the steps. The microphone loomed before him like a challenge. His hands trembled as he gripped it, looking out over the sea of faces. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. My name is Carson Benson. A week ago, I was just an angry kid who thought he knew everything. The words started coming easier as he continued. I did something terrible. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it just because I could. Because I thought that's what strong people did, hurt others before they could hurt you. He found Big Joe's encouraging nod in the crowd. But these men, these bikers everyone's so quick to judge, they showed me what real strength looks like. It's not in your fists. It's not in how tough you act or how many people you can push around. Carson's voice grew stronger, more confident. I thought strength was about making others feel small. Turns out it's about forgiveness. It's about helping others stand tall. It's about facing your mistakes and choosing to be better. The crowd had grown silent, hanging on his words. I'm not fixed. I've got a long way to go. But thanks to these men, I'm learning that it's never too late to change your road. That's what this is all about, isn't it? Giving people, even stupid, angry kids like me, a chance to find a better way. Applause erupted from the crowd. Carson saw several bikers wiping their eyes, and even some of his own crew looked suspiciously misty. As he descended the stage, they surrounded him with hugs and backslaps. Proud of you, kid, Big Joe said, his voice gruff with emotion. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Carson helped serve food, listened to more stories, and watched children's faces light up as they sat on parked motorcycles. He found himself sharing his own story again and again, each telling making it more real, more meaningful. As night fell, the crew gathered around one of many bonfires dotting the grounds. The flames danced against the darkening sky, and the atmosphere was electric with fellowship and hope. Hey, new kid, Red called out, tossing Carson a soda. Catch! Carson caught the can, then froze. What did you call me? The bikers exchanged knowing looks. Well, Big Joe explained, every brother needs a road name. We figured New Kid fits you pretty well. Reminds us all that everyone starts somewhere, that we're all new to the right path at some point. Carson turned the nickname over in his mind. New Kid, not punk, not troublemaker, not lost cause. New kid, someone at the beginning of something, someone with potential. I like it, he said softly, and the men grinned. The first firework burst overhead, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Carson watched, transfixed, as more followed. Red, blue, gold, and green flowers blooming against the black canvas of night. Each explosion reflected in his eyes, like sparks of possibility, of hope. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that diner a week ago. That angry boy felt like a stranger now. Sitting here, surrounded by these unlikely brothers, watching light paint the darkness, Carson felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. More fireworks filled the sky, their light catching the chrome of hundreds of motorcycles and the faces of countless people who had found their way home through the unlikeliest of families. The night air was filled with the sound of fellowship, laughter, and the quiet miracle of hearts being transformed. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as the convoy of motorcycles thundered into a small southern town. Their chrome gleaming, the bikes pulled into a weathered gas station, its faded signs and cracked pavement telling stories of better days. Carson dismounted behind Big Joe, his legs stiff from the morning ride. The past week's lessons had changed him, softened his edges, but something raw and uncertain still churned beneath the surface. He stretched, watching the other bikers fill their tanks and check their oil levels. A group of local teens lounged against pickup trucks across the street, their laughter carrying over the rumble of idling engines. At first, Carson barely noticed them, just background noise in another small town. But then the words started floating across the asphalt, sharp and ugly. "Hey, look at the old-timer brigade," one called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet they still think they're tough." Carson's shoulders tensed, but he tried to follow what he'd learned. Breathe deep, let it go. The bikers ignored the taunts, conducting their business with quiet dignity. But the teens weren't finished. One of them, a lanky boy in a Confederate flag t-shirt, stepped forward. "Hey, pretty boy," he shouted at Carson. "What's wrong? Mommy and Daddy kick you out? Had to go running to these losers?" Carson's hands curled into fists, but Big Joe's steady presence beside him kept him still. Then came the words that shattered his control. "Heard y'all been hanging around that colored waitress's diner, too. What's wrong, boy? Can't find decent white folks to ride with?" The world went red. Before anyone could grab him, Carson crossed the street in 3 long strides, his fist connected with the teen's jaw, sending him sprawling. "Don't you dare talk about her!" he roared. Chaos erupted. The teen's friends jumped in, and suddenly the gas station lot became a whirlwind of flying fists and angry shouts. Carson fought like a wild thing, all his careful lessons forgotten in a haze of righteous fury. Strong hands grabbed him from behind, Doc and Red pulling him back, while other bikers moved to separate the brawlers. "Enough!" Big Joe's voice boomed across the lot like thunder. The local boys scattered, leaving their friend to scramble up and limp away, shooting venomous looks over his shoulder. Carson struggled against the hands holding him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let me go. Did you hear what they said? About Alina? About all of you?" "Get him on the bike," Big Joe ordered, his voice cold with disappointment. "We're leaving. Now." They rode for another hour, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. When they finally made camp near a wooded riverbank, Carson's anger had cooled into something worse. Shame. Big Joe waited until the others were setting up tents before confronting him. 7 days, he said, his voice heavy. 7 days we've been teaching you about breaking the cycle of hate. And what do? Jump right back in at the first chance. "They deserved it," Carson protested, but his voice wavered. "The things they said. You think I don't know what hate sounds like?" Big Joe's eyes flashed. "You think any of us haven't heard worse? But you still don't get it, son. You can't fight hate by becoming it. Those boys, they're just like you were a week ago. Angry, ignorant, lashing out. And you just proved them right about everything they think about us." The words hit Carson like physical blows. He staggered back, tears burning his eyes. Without a word, he turned and grabbed his backpack from beside the motorcycle. "Where do you think you're going?" Big Joe demanded. "Away, I'm done." Carson's voice cracked. "I can't do this. I'm not good enough. I'll never be good enough." He stormed into the woods, branches whipping at his face as he pushed through the undergrowth. Behind him, he heard Doc ask if they should go after him. "Let him go," Big Joe replied. "Sometimes a man needs to wrestle with his demons alone." The sky darkened as Carson wandered, his mind a tornado of self-loathing and regret. Everything he'd learned, all the progress he'd made, destroyed in one moment of weakness. He thought of Alina's gentle strength, of the bikers' patient teachings, of all the stories of redemption he'd heard around their campfires. Fat raindrops began to fall, pattering through the leaves above. Carson barely noticed, lost in his spiral of shame. His feet carried him to the riverbank, where he finally collapsed beneath a massive oak tree. The rain intensified, soaking through his clothes, but he didn't care. "I'm sorry," he whispered to no one, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'll never be good enough. Never be worth forgiving." Thunder rolled overhead as Carson hugged his knees to his chest, making himself small against the storm. Water dripped from his hair, mixing with the tears on his face, After what felt like hours, he mechanically reached for his backpack, thinking to find something dry to wear. His hand brushed against something leather-bound and familiar. Pulling it out, Carson stared at Big Joe's worn Bible, its pages softened by years of handling. He hadn't put it there, hadn't even seen Big Joe slip it into his pack. But here it was, like a lifeline in the storm. The rain continued to fall around him as Carson held the Bible in trembling hands, its presence both an accusation and a promise. Carson's hands trembled as he opened the Bible, its pages damp from the rain but still readable. The leather cover was soft and worn, telling stories of years of handling. As he carefully turned to the first page, something slipped out and fluttered to the wet ground between his feet. He picked it up, a weathered photograph, its edges worn smooth with age. The image showed a much younger Big Joe, his face unlined, but his eyes already carrying that same weight Carson had come to know. He knelt in military fatigues beside the smoking ruins of what had once been someone's home. Behind him, a Vietnamese village burned, black smoke curling against a gray sky. The young soldier's expression wasn't triumphant or proud, just haunted. With shaking fingers, Carson turned the photograph over. There, in careful handwriting that he recognized as Big Joe's, was a simple message that made his breath catch. Hurt people, heal, and you'll help heal others. The words blurred as fresh tears filled his eyes. He thought about his own anger, how it had festered inside him for so long, making him lash out at anyone who came close. Like those boys at the gas station, like himself, just a week ago at the diner. Lightning flashed overhead as Carson began to flip through the Bible's pages. Big Joe had marked passages throughout, underlining verses and making notes in the margins. Many sections were highlighted in yellow, the ink slightly faded but still clear. His eyes caught on one highlighted verse. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. The simplicity of it struck him like a physical blow. Another page, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Carson remembered the hate in those boys' eyes at the gas station, how his fists had flown without thought. He'd become exactly what they expected, exactly what he'd been before. Rain dripped from the leaves above as he read passage after passage about mercy, about second chances, about the strength it takes to choose love over hatred. Big Joe's neat handwriting filled the margins with dates and personal notes. Remember my lie, choose better, forgave myself today, 30 years later. God's mercy bigger than my mistakes. Something broke open inside Carson's chest. Here was proof that even the strongest man he knew had wrestled with the same demons, had fought the same battles with himself, and won. If Big Joe could find his way from that burning village to becoming the man he was today. Please, Carson whispered, his first real prayer rising raw and honest in the rain. Please help me. I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to hurt people. Show me how to be better. Give me the strength to do what's right. He stayed there through the long night, reading by flashlight when the storm allowed, thinking during the darkest moments. The rain eventually settled into a gentle drizzle, then stopped altogether. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the trees, Carson found himself feeling emptied out and clean, like the storm had washed away something poisonous inside him. He made his way to the riverbank, watching the water flow past, steady and sure. The sound of footsteps behind him didn't make him turn. He knew who it would be. You found it, Big Joe said quietly, noticing the Bible in Carson's lap. You knew I would need it. We all need reminding sometimes that grace exists. Big Joe settled beside him on the damp ground. Even when we don't deserve it, especially then. Carson ran his fingers over the photograph he'd been using as a bookmark. How did you do it? How did you stop hating yourself long enough to change? Who says I've stopped completely? Big Joe's laugh was gentle. It's a daily choice, son. Every morning you decide who you're going to be. Some days are harder than others, but it gets easier with practice. They sat in companionable silence as the sun rose, painting the river in shades of gold. One by one, the other bikers emerged from the camp, gathering quietly behind them. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Finally, Big Joe stood, brushing off his jeans. He looked down at Carson, his eyes warm but searching. You ready to finish what you started? Carson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the Bible in his hands, the lesson of the photograph in his heart. He nodded, standing up straight. Yes, sir, I am. They walked back to the bikes together, the morning air fresh and clean after the storm. As Carson mounted behind Big Joe, he felt different, lighter somehow. The road ahead didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like purpose. The engines roared to life, and the crew pulled out onto the highway, heading back toward Alina's diner. Carson watched the sunrise in the side mirror, thinking about forgiveness and second chances, about hurt people learning to heal. The words from the photograph echoed in his mind. Hurt people, heal, and you'll help heal others. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind on his face and the rumble of the bike beneath him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Carson felt peace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the highway as the convoy of motorcycles rumbled into the familiar streets of the small Tennessee town. Carson's stomach tightened with each passing mile. He recognized the gas station where he used to loiter, the corner store where he'd shoplifted candy bars, the park where he'd picked fights. Everything looked different now, like he was seeing it through new eyes. When the diner's faded sign appeared in the distance, Carson's heart began to pound so hard he could barely breathe. The building stood exactly as they'd left it 7 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed. The gravel parking lot was half full of trucks, and through the wide windows, he could see the usual morning crowd nursing their coffee cups. Big Joe led the procession into the lot, cutting the engine. The other bikes lined up beside him, their rumbling falling silent one by one. Carson climbed off, his legs shaky. The morning air felt thick with tension. You ready, son? Big Joe asked quietly, holding out the framed photograph they'd picked up earlier that morning. It showed Alina's son in his dress uniform, smile bright and proud. The other bikers gathered around, each holding bouquets of fresh flowers they'd bought at the market down the road. Carson nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. He straightened his shoulders and walked toward the diner's entrance alone, each step feeling heavier than the last. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open. The breakfast chatter died immediately. Every head turned to stare at him. The truckers, the veterans, the locals who'd witnessed his cruel display a week ago. Some faces showed surprise, others wariness. The old veteran he'd mocked was there too, watching him with steady eyes over his coffee cup. And there was Alina, moving between tables with a coffee pot, her movements as graceful and dignified as ever. She paused when she saw him, but her face remained calm. The bruise he'd left had faded, but Carson felt the shame of it burn, fresh in his chest. His feet carried him forward until he stood before her. Up close, he could see the wisdom in her eyes, the quiet strength that had made her choose mercy over vengeance. His carefully prepared speech disappeared, leaving only raw truth. I'm sorry, he said, his voice shaking, for what I did, for what I was. The words seemed so small compared to the weight of his actions, but they carried all his heart could hold. Alina studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Carson stood still under her gaze, letting her see everything: his remorse, his change, his hope for forgiveness. Finally, something in her expression softened as she recognized the sincerity in his eyes. "Then let's both start fresh," she said quietly, extending her hand. Carson stared at it for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple grace of the gesture. When he took her hand, his own was trembling. The handshake felt like more than just forgiveness. It was a promise, a new beginning, a moment of healing that reached beyond just the two of them. The emotion hit him all at once. Tears spilled down his cheeks as 7 days of transformation, of learning, of facing himself crashed over him. Behind him, the door chimed again as the bikers entered, their boots heavy on the linoleum floor. They surrounded Carson and Alina, laying their flowers on the counter, creating a circle of support and witness to this moment of reconciliation. Big Joe stepped forward, gently presenting the framed photograph. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we wanted you to have this. Your boy's memory deserves to be honored here." Alina's hands trembled slightly as she took the frame, touching her son's face through the glass. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling, a smile full of loss and love and hope all at once. The diner seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had filled the room since Carson's entrance dissolved, replaced by something lighter, something healing. Regular customers returned to their conversations, but the tone had changed. The veterans nodded approvingly, the truckers smiled into their coffee cups, and even the old sergeant raised his mug in a quiet salute. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the tears on Carson's face, illuminating the flowers on the counter, warming the photograph in Alina's hands. In that light, the diner felt less like a place of business and more like a sanctuary, a space where grace had won over hatred, where healing had overcome hurt, where one small moment of forgiveness had changed everything. The diner became Carson's second home in the weeks that followed. Every Saturday and Sunday morning, he'd arrive before sunrise, tying on an apron and getting the coffee started before Alina even walked through the door. His hands, once clenched in anger, now carried plates with care and wiped tables until they shone. "Good morning, sir," he'd say to each veteran who came through the door, meaning it more each time. The old sergeant who'd felt his mockery weeks ago now shared stories of Carson's deployment, and Carson listened with genuine interest, learning about sacrifice and service over steaming mugs of coffee. The Hells Angels made the diner their regular stop, their bikes filling the parking lot every few days. They'd bring other riders, veterans, and travelers with them, filling the booths with laughter and conversation. Big Joe would wink at Carson as he refilled their cups, proud of the way the boy carried himself now, straight-backed, clear-eyed, and quick to smile. Alina watched over it all like a guardian angel, teaching Carson with quiet words and gentle corrections. "Slow down," she'd say when he rushed. "Each person deserves your full attention." Under her guidance, he learned to read people's needs before they spoke them. A refill for the tired trucker, an extra napkin for the elderly couple, a kind word for the lonely widow. Together they created a "Pay It Forward" board near the register. Carson painted it himself, adding little drawings of coffee cups and plates around the edges. Customers would leave prepaid meals, pinning dollars and notes to the board. "For a veteran in need," one might read. "For someone having a rough day," said another. Carson felt his heart lift every time he got to tell someone their meal had been covered by a stranger's kindness. One Sunday morning, his mother walked into the diner. She stood in the doorway, watching her son serve customers with a gentleness she'd never seen in him before. When Carson spotted her, He wrapped her in a hug, and she began to cry, touching his face as if making sure he was real. "You're different," she whispered. "You're my boy again." That evening, the parking lot transformed into an impromptu gathering. The bikers fired up their grills, locals brought dishes to share, and veterans sat in lawn chairs swapping stories. Under strings of lights someone had hung. Carson stood up to say grace before the meal. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd, "for the people who showed me mercy when I didn't deserve it, who taught me that real strength isn't in how hard you can hit, but in how much you can love." His eyes met Alina's, then Big Joe's, then swept across the faces of all those who'd become his unlikely family. Above them, the stars seemed to twinkle in agreement, witnesses to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of change. 6 months had transformed the diner into something magical. Sunlight streamed through spotless windows, catching the frames that now covered nearly every wall. There, in proud display, were dozens of photographs telling stories of service and redemption. Alina's son smiled from his military portrait, eternally young in his pressed uniform. Beside it hung photos of local veterans, their faces weathered but dignified, each one a testament to sacrifice. The newest addition drew everyone's eye, Carson standing tall among Big Joe's crew, their leather vests gleaming in the sun. His smile in that photo was different from any he'd worn before. Peaceful, genuine, whole. Below it hung a simple wooden sign in Carson's careful handwriting. "No one too lost to find their way home." At 18 years old, Carson had changed in ways that went deeper than his appearance. The anger that once twisted his features had smoothed into something gentler. His GED certificate hung behind the counter, and acceptance letters from the local community college lay carefully folded in his wallet. Social work, he'd decided. He wanted to help others find their way back, just as he had. On his last morning in town, dew still fresh on the grass, Carson knelt beside Alina's grave. She'd passed quietly 2 months ago, leaving behind a legacy of kindness that touched countless lives. He placed a bundle of wildflowers, purple and yellow, picked from the roadside, against the cool stone. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for seeing past who I was to who I could be." The morning breeze carried his prayer across the peaceful cemetery. The rumble of a motorcycle broke the silence. Big Joe pulled up on his Harley, his gray beard catching the early light. He waited respectfully as Carson stood, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Ride straight, son," Big Joe said, extending his weathered hand. "You did good?" Carson gripped it firmly, tears flowing freely now. His own motorcycle, the very same one Big Joe had helped him restore over countless patient hours, waited nearby, ready for the open road. As he rode away, the rising sun painted the sky in shades of gold and promise. The highway stretched before him like an invitation to a new life. Carson felt it deep in his soul. He was finally free. Not from responsibility or consequences, but from the hatred that had once poisoned his heart. The wind carried him forward, toward whatever good lay ahead. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.